This episode of the Fishing Daily podcast is brought to you by Saltwater Marketing. Saltwater Marketing, marketing experts for the commercial fishing and seafood industry in the UK and Ireland. Welcome again to the Fishing Daily podcast with me, Oliver McBride. In this episode, I'm joined by Luke Pollard MP and former Shadow Fisheries Minister. Welcome, Luke.
You're right.
Look, you're an MP for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport. And as former Shadow Fisheries Minister, you've been very close to what's happening to the UK fishing industry on the ground for the past 2 years. And between COVID and Brexit, what's it been like for them?
Oh, I think the fishing industry's had an incredibly torrid time over the past few years. It's not only been the economic circumstances that have put immense pressure on fishers and seafood exporters as well, but it's been the erosion of trust in people that have made big promises to the industry, the hopes that were dashed with a Brexit deal that screwed them over, and then continuing problems with the sector that's come from the pandemic. And I think for me, one of the really big challenges that I think politics is missing out when we talk about fishing. We often talk about the policies around fishing. We talk around, where we are on maximum sustainable yield, where we are on in terms of, marine protections. But the bit that's missing frequently is the pressures on fishers as individuals, on them and their families. And I'm really, really worried about the stress and pressures that are being piled onto our coastal fleets, fishermen, their families, exporters, everyone involved with the entire fishing industry, because it seems to be getting worse and there's no real end in sight for it. And as we know from reports that have been done in the fishing industry, beyond those really large, often foreign-owned fishing businesses, the majority of our small-scale fishers, which are the backbone of the fleet and certainly the backbone in Plymouth, where I represent, they don't have a lot of financial savings. They don't have a lot of resources available to them. And when you've been squeezed by the pandemic, closing off your markets, when you've been squeezed by kind of needlessly bureaucratic regulation like the CatchApp and the new IVMS stuff, there's a real pressure. And what worries me is that it's not only the pressure on those individuals and their families, it's putting a question mark over whether they'll continue in the sector. And what I don't want to see is decommissioning by stealth. Fishers, getting so annoyed and frustrated by the government's approach, the overall approach to the sector, the difficulty in bringing back money to put food on the table, that they are having a voluntary decommissioning scheme by stealth, effectively. If government wants to shrink the number of fishing boats, they should state that clearly and have a proper decommissioning and compensation package. What they shouldn't be doing is screwing over fishers in the way they have been and achieving that by stealth without any public support for those industries and those communities that rely on fishing.
CatchApp seems to be a bit of a bugbear for the under 10 and under 12 metre vessels that has to apply them. When you read about this 10% margin and all this year, it must, as you think, it's putting pressure on fishers.
I think it really is. I mean, the CatchApp in my mind is a perfect example of regulation that sounds good on a spreadsheet on some official's desk, but when you're doing it in reality, it's almost impossible to achieve. So we know that there's data deficiency in how the UK collects data on fishing. We know that we need to improve that, especially now we're a third country and we need better data to be able to export our catches into the EU. But putting in the CatchApp, which probably won't be sufficiently robust for our European friends, at a point where you're trying to guess the weight of the fish that you've caught, additional handling that not only damages the quality of the fish that you've caught, but, I was speaking to folks about this, and, the CatchApp is something that I've, gone quite hard on as in my time as an MP. So I just think it's a needless example of bureaucracy. But when you're explaining it to someone who doesn't follow the ins and outs of fishing policy, and you're saying, right, so before the fishers land their catch in the hold, they've got to guesstimate the weight of the fish. They won't have marinized scales on every single boat. So they're guessing it, they're handling it again, and they're landing it only to put it through a grading machine. Well, they'll get all that information in only a few minutes' time, but they're required to do so, enter it on an app where they might not even have a mobile signal to be able to do that. And people look at you like, have we really thought that through? And I think the difficulty we've got is it's no longer possible for the government to blame everything on Brussels. It's no longer them to say, oh, that's European regulation, so, oh, it's rubbish, but we have to do it. They're choosing this. This is homegrown British red tape. And it's in the worst tradition of bureaucracy because it doesn't work. It doesn't achieve the objectives. It annoys everybody. And it is, and it's adding cost to businesses. And so I do want to see proper changes in how the CatchApp is worked. And I'm concerned that now the government's got to the point where they're going to start enforcing. They've given quite a lot of leeway for fishers. Well, I think that is for them to fix their own problems that they've created. But now they're going to start, I think, looking at who to prosecute. So there will be small scale fishers who are struggling to make the app work, to do what it needs to do, who will now be at risk of potential prosecution because of this. And that is very concerning because this is a broken system and a broken policy, but doesn't achieve the objective. So it's pain all round. And ministers really need to think again about it, I think.
Another area the inshore fleet seems to be having a problem with, especially along the south coast, is the licensing issue for EU registered vessels. Initially, Brexiteers promised that there would be nobody inside the 12 nautical mile limit, and now we're seeing an influx nearly, especially in the English Channel, of vessels in that area because under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the negotiators allowed for it. That's another added pressure for your inshore fleet.
Oh, it is. It is. And I think, to understand the pain that's been caused by problems over licensing and access, you've got to understand the promises that were made to fishing, because fishing was really screwed over on the way into the EU, and they've certainly been screwed over in an epic way on the way out of the EU. But it's quite, when I've been speaking to fishers in Plymouth since I was elected and when I stood in 2015, but just narrowly lost, the concerns they were raising wasn't built around a hatred of Brussels or an anti-Europeanism. It was built around a real hope that their industry would prosper outside of the common fisheries policy, that the regulations would give them back the 6 to 12 as a way of the promises. And they heard those promises from Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, Michael Gove, leading Brexiteers, only to have all those promises reversed when the agreement came out. And that's because the government and the Leave campaign regarded fishing as useful idiots, as completely disposable, that they could promote them and push them up there and get the benefit of the concern from fishers. But the problem is fishing's not full of idiots. It's full of incredibly entrepreneurial, innovative, smart people who were promised something and in good faith believed some of the most serious and prominent people in our country. And that's where the pain around access to coastal waters really comes from, because the government's been treating the industry like fools. But the industry's got a good argument here. They were promised that they would have exclusive access. They don't. They were promised that they would have more fish. And, I think the majority of the fish that's come from the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is paper fish. It only swims on spreadsheets. It doesn't exist in the sea. And even if it does exist, much of the gear required to catch it is only held by foreign-owned boats. So I don't think there's any real improvement in quota catch available for them. But it's also locked in these pretty rubbish quota shares forevermore. Now, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement says that, 2026, you can review the quota shares. And to do that, you'd then look at tariffs and other products. So let's be entirely honest. The government has baked in these rubbish quota shares forevermore. A Conservative government, a Labour government, they might be able to tweak around the edges, but fundamentally, those rubbish shares are now locked in due to the complete betrayal of the industry in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And that is something that we need to be absolutely clear about, because there will be folks quite legitimately looking to 2026 going, please, let's make sure that we can get something better than we had before. And I hope we can. But what worries me is the deal is so bad and fishing is so political that the government has no interest in actually improving the detail of the deal. They're still interested in using fishing as a political stick to scare voters into saying, look at the big bad French and the big bad EU coming for our fishers. Well, if they want to support British fishing, They could be properly investing in our ports. They could be having a proper focus on deregulation and removing some of the nonsense that we're seeing. So properly investing in marine safety, properly investing in skills, so fishing becomes a career of choice, not just something where you go into because your brother or your dad or your uncle works in. That's really where we've got to get to. I don't see any of that. And so fishers have every right to feel betrayed by this. And the challenge, I think, for folks like myself, especially ones in opposition, is how do you make an ambitious fishing policy that will recognise that fishers feel completely screwed over, because they have been, that realises that we're locked into a poor, botched Brexit deal with the European Union that's hard to change, but that we do need improvements on. And that, I think, is a really difficult challenge, because what I don't want to do, and what I don't want my party to do, even though I don't lead on fishing policy anymore, is to make promises that can't be achieved, because fishers have been promised enough and had those promises broken. I think what we've got to do is under-promise and over-deliver for fishing. And that is the way that you rebuild some of the trust that has been so purposely and deliberately broken by the government that we have today.
You're talking about broken promises there. One of the broken promises was marine conservation. There was a conservation clause in the Fisheries Act that was removed, and the time it was removed was that Victoria Apprentice said, oh no, we've built in all these guarantees that the marine fish will be conserved, etc., etc., etc. But by allowing foreign vessels into the 12-mile limit, they seem to be fishing a lot of non-quota species, which your inshore fisherman is relying on, and they are also a valuable food source for other fish. Do you think that the fishermen have also been let down in the area of marine conservation?
Yeah, I mean, marine conservation is a hard one, because the debate around it is often positioned as fishing versus environmentalists, and that's not how I see it. Because if we don't have a sustainable fishing industry, economically and environmentally, we don't have an industry. We don't have the jobs, and so we're really screwed then. So as an out and out greenie, right, I believe that we need to massively change the way that we look after our oceans, and that does mean changing the way that fishing works. But that needs to be done with the fishing industry, not to the fishing industry. And what concerns me is the approach that DEFRA in particular have taken around, let's say, highly protected marine areas. So I want to see more of our oceans protected. I am concerned about how some of our stocks are being pursued, especially non-quota species where we don't have high levels of data, so we can't really see what's happening on those. I'd like us to have no data deficient stocks. That was an amendment that I put forward in the Fisheries Bill to require government to invest properly in science right across all the species. They defeated that proposal, sadly. So I do think we need to look carefully at, what is being caught, how is it being done. But if you are, for instance, to have highly protected marine areas where, fishing is banned, and let's remember that the UK has signed up to the UN Oceans Treaty correctly. What that treaty says is that 30% of your waters need to be fully protected, i.e. no take zones, by 2030. Now, the government has neglected to mention the fully protected bit in their announcements about it, which so often is the case. It's designed to look busy but not deliver what they've promised to do. Well, if they are to play catch up as we get towards 2030 and suddenly realise, it's not enough to put a new marine protected area around, Ascension Island in the middle of the Atlantic, or Tristan to Kahuna, or the Pitcairn Islands, which is what their strategy is currently. We're going to have to do more in UK waters. Well, let's have that conversation with fishers. Let's be clear about where fishing can't happen and where it can happen, because the concern I have is they're suddenly just going to be displaced overnight with an announcement that doesn't bring fishers along board, because I know that fishers want to see healthy fish stocks. And if there is a bit where there needs to be better protection, especially of really fragile and important marine habitats, nursery grounds in particular for fish, we need to do it. But that only works if that is applied to UK fishers and European fishers. Because over the past few years, gobby folk like me have been raising issues around electro-pulse beam trawling that our Dutch friends have been using, fly shooting that our Dutch friends are going to be using, about massive foreign-owned super trawlers fishing deliberately in our marine protected areas, landing all their fish in foreign ports, so we get no economic benefit as a country from it. Well, whatever applies to us must apply to them. And I think the debate around marine conservation is a good one. We do need to have it. Fishers need to be around the table in a meaningful way, but we need to make sure that is applied against a clear timetable, so fishers can adjust their fishing practices, invest in different gear, whatever it may be. But what concerns me is that it looks at the moment like this is regulation of British boats over foreign boats. And the government, for some reason, I don't understand this, considering how much, they pride themselves on this kind of like Brexit, puffing up of their chests, why they haven't clamped down on foreign boats that do so much damage to our marine protected areas in particular, which is probably where the environmentalists are most focused. But the answer won't be just for British boats. It needs to be across the board. It needs to be against a clear plan, it needs to be science-led. And where there is data deficiency, we need investment early to build up that data, because quite a lot of the fishers that we have in Plymouth go to sea with scientists, collect data as well as catching fish, and want to contribute to more sustainable oceans. Now, that I think shows the direction of travel, but we need ministers to fully participate in that, and they're not at the moment, and they should be.
As well as the fishermen, we were looking at also like recreational fisheries, recreational craft, everything else to get there. Do you think that the whole environment has to be protected rather than just protecting it from fishing? Like I find, as we call it, where I live, that every year I'm noticing less and less and less juvenile fish, and more speedboats in the area. And people say it's not related, but I think it's related. Do you feel that maybe we should be looking at issues like that as well, not just at the fishing industry?
Yeah, so recreational fishing for a GDP contribution is now bigger than commercial fishing. It's a fact that many fishers are very unhappy about, but nonetheless it is true. And as an MP for a coastal community, I have an enormous number of people who work in fishing. There's nearly 1,000 jobs in fishing in the patch that I represent. But there's a lot of people that have interest in recreational fishing as well. And I think the value of recreational fishing has not been fully understood by government. It's kind of a bit of an afterthought in the post-Brexit fisheries regulation. I think it's an enormous opportunity to create more jobs, good jobs, but you've got to have an understanding about the fish stocks that you're playing with. So as an example, one of the campaigns that I've been involved in the Southwest, working alongside Tory MPs like Derek Thomas, who's the Tory MP for St Ives, has been about looking at bluefin tuna. Now, these incredible, majestic beasts are now appearing in our western approaches, in our waters more frequently, and they haven't been for a very, very long time. That is probably to do with the migration of its feed sources further north as climate warms the waters. But we're now getting them in our waters. So we've got a choice as a country. Do we pretend they're not there? Do we catch them as commercial food, or do we catch them as recreational food on a tag and release scheme? And so I've been arguing that we need to understand what's happening. A tag and release scheme, I think, is a good way of doing that. We've now persuaded the government to have a pilot in that. Now, some of the environmental groups were not happy with me over this because they said we should just protect those. Well, I said, well, the option is not to protect it. The alternative option to doing this is to eat all of them rather than to have catch and release. So we do need that thorough debate around what recreational fishing does, how it fits in, but where you've got the potential to create more sustainable jobs in our coastal communities, invest in our tourism products, I think we should be taking it. But as we saw around the bass fisheries a few years ago, where you put restrictions on recreational fishers and commercial fishers, but then have them as uneven, well, everyone feels aggrieved and unhappy about that situation. So you do need to tell a better story, and that story needs to be science-led, and that science needs to be informed by the experience of everybody in it. But I do worry that the fishing methods that are sometimes being pursued are leading to smaller fish being killed, so they're not able to get to the point of reproduction, and that is not a sustainable way of having healthy fish stocks anywhere around the UK coast.
Back to the political front, Do you think that Labour, if they ever got back into power again, could bring the Trade and Corporation Agreement? Do you think that they could have a try for a better deal in 2026?
Well, the great advantages of no longer being in the shadow cabinet is that I'm allowed a more freer hand on this one here. But actually, on this one here, I think actually our position is probably broadly right. You know, our Labour's position on Brexit is to make Brexit work, because there's not an option of rejoining. That's not an option available. Putting up with the Tories' deal means economic suicide for sectors. If you look at the live bivalve mollusk sector, I'm not sure how many of your podcast listeners work in that, but incredible sustainable fisheries like the foul oyster fishery, utterly screwed over by us becoming a third country, not able to export our oysters and mussels into the European Union because they come from grade B waters. There are some howling errors and omissions in the Trade and Corporation Agreement that does need to be addressed. And I think there's a difference between when you approach the revision and the review of TAC in a few years' time, about whether you're going in there with a big knife to slash and burn it, which won't be accepted, I think, by the European Union, or whether you're saying, here are the areas where we think we can work together to get a better deal. And the massive overlay of bureaucracy that we've seen because of the deal that the Prime Minister chose. He didn't have to choose this one, he chose this one. And so the absence of a veterinary agreement, for instance, seems like a massive blunder by the Prime Minister. If we had a veterinary agreement, now I don't think anyone really voted Brexit because they didn't want to have veterinary checks aligned on one side of the channel to the other, really don't. But if we get a veterinary agreement in place, that means we can do away with much of the nonsensical paperwork about inspections of fish exports and other food exports that we see between the UK and our friends in the EU. Well, that would cut costs, make things more easily, and make Brexit work better. Now, I'm a Remainer. I campaigned to remain in the European Union, but we lost that argument. We're now out of the European Union, and we've got a rubbish deal. So we need to make that deal better, and we need to make Brexit work. Now, I want a Labour government, well, I want one soon, but I want that Labour government to be looking carefully about where across, not just fisheries, but farming and others that we can get at. And I think that starts with a different starting point strategically. So the government's quite happy having our domestic production industries undermined by both trade deals and the relationship with Brussels. We've seen that with farmers being undercut with beef produced to lower standards in Australia, for instance. That's going to put lots of our beef farmers out of business. But they're also doing that a lot with fishers as well. And so I want us to grow more food in Britain. I want us to eat more British food, right? That's my starting point. It cuts carbon, it supports local jobs, and it deals with the fact that we're in a more contested international situation where having supply chains that rely on farmers and fishers on the other side of the planet is probably not a great idea. But to do that, we not only need to change regulations, change emphasis, change procurement. I want government to be buying more British produce. Quite a lot of government departments don't even buy British fish. Right. And so, we've got some really low hanging fruit we can go on there. And then we've got the harder challenge, especially around fishing, about how do we encourage more British shoppers to buy British fish? So one of the challenges I give to some of my MP colleagues on this one, when they look at me a little bit, really, is walk down your beef aisle at a supermarket and you'll be confronted by an array of British flags. There might be the Union flag, you might have the Scottish one there, sometimes it's British and Irish. If in Wales, you've got lots of Welsh flags, right? Go to the fish aisle and there's not a flag to be seen. Why is that? Because we as shoppers have been conditioned into buying British and buying local when it comes to meat, but buying foreign and not thinking about it when it comes to fish. Now, if we are to support our fishers better, and brilliant initiatives like Call for Fish that we saw during the lockdown about keeping small-scale fishers in particular in business when their markets closed, if we want more British fish to be bought, we've got to start getting British shoppers used to buying British more and looking out for British fish. Now, in Plymouth, we saw a brilliant initiative working with Aldi, and so one of our fish processors doing a deal with Aldi to sell Plymouth landed fish in Aldi's right across the country. Brilliant. Let's have more of that. And that's why, I've challenged all the British supermarkets from the floor of the House of Commons to sell more British fish. Come on, What's your excuse? And the thing is, it's cheaper buying from abroad because that's what we're used to. Well, how about we have an objective to buy British and change the rules of the game so our British fishers and farmers have a better deal? That's what I think the next Labour government should, ought and will do. And that contrasts really clearly with a government that says, oh, let's just buy cheaper stuff from abroad. Now, you can argue that either side has got a point on this one here, but them's the options available at the next general election. More British produce at home with Labour, or more foreign products undercutting our domestic production with the Tories. And you can very clearly see that in action at the moment. So that's a pretty clear choice, I think we'll be going into the next general election with.
It seems that UK fish processors seem to rely heavily on exporting to the continent. And like as you were writing on, or you're in an interview that you did with The Guardian for Sunday's edition, you're talking about, the threat of a French blockade by fishermen, even though now that this UK licensing agreement seems to be put to bed between France, EU and the UK, there still seems to be this threat because everybody hasn't got their license. Is that something that, we're looking forward to Christmas now? Is that threat still there, do you think?
I think it is. And I think this goes to the heart of how fishers on both sides of the channel feel about the Brexit agreement. British fishers feel screwed over, but so do French fishers, right? So we often view it as, oh, those French fishers must be really happy that we've been so upset. Well, they're really unhappy about it as well. And so you've got both sides of the channel, industries that are really unhappy with the deal. You've got governments, both with Macron and with Boris Johnson, who realise that fishing is an identity issue just as much as it is an economic issue. So use it to, create fire in the belly of their electorates. Look at us standing up for our country. Well, if you want to stand up for fishing, you do a deal that works for both sides, right? You lower the rhetoric, you take down the kind of like, the nonsense that we saw from ministers, a few months ago, and you get a good deal. Now, there is a deal in place. Yeah, it's a start of something, isn't it? It's better than we had before, probably. But there's lots of French fishers who are very unhappy. So I don't think they'll be blockading with their boats, but there's still a risk of blockading by putting some tyres out and burning them, as we've seen from French farmers and fishers in the past. And so there's still a risk of that. But the period between now and Christmas is really important for many of our high value exports in particular. And there's not a period of the year where actually it's not unimportant for our fish exports, but this certainly is one of the most important. So I do worry about there being disruption, but in that case, that disruption is illegal, should not be tolerated, and should be clamped down by the French authorities. The British can't do anything about truck tires being set on fire outside, plants in northern France, but the French government can. And having signed this agreement, they must. And that means we need to be utterly robust in support of our fishing industry, but also clear that ramping up rhetoric, playing games, and trying to hit each other over the head with big sticks, well, that risks confrontation at sea, and confrontation at sea risks fishers' lives. And I don't think we should be playing that game.
Another area that you're passionate about is safety at sea, and you've been a very, very strong advocate for it. And in your time since you took over as Shadow Fisheries Minister, have you seen a lot of change happening?
Yeah, I mean, there has been improvements over the past few years on fishing. And it was only a couple of days ago in the Commons that I was in there for a debate called by Carl Turner, the Labour MP in Hull, to get a national memorial day for lost trawlermen, which is kind of on a national scale what happens in Hull already after the triple trawler tragedy of 1968, which kind of triggered the headscarf revolutionaries, which was in many cases the start of real domestic improvements in fishing safety. There's lots of things that have improved, and I would say this because obviously for me as a Plymouth MP, the entire world revolves around what happens in the PL postcode area. But actually in Plymouth, we've got some really good initiatives. And one of them that I want to see rolled out more, seriously nationwide is the rollout of the Plymouth Life Jacket Scheme. That is issuing fishers with life jackets that come equipped with personal locator beacons. So if they are washed overboard, or if they fall overboard, then you take the search out of search and rescue. Now that does mean you need to do a few things. firstly, it means you need to have one of these life jackets and PLBs. Secondly, they need to be in good order. And thirdly, perhaps most importantly, you've got to wear it. Right. And I think one of the real improvements I've seen over the past few years in particular is actually government and the MMO and Seafish and the industry getting more serious about saying you've got to wear your life jacket. Because if you wear it, you stand a better chance of coming home. And if you are killed, and sadly, we are still losing far too many fishers at sea. If they are killed, then you've got a better chance of having a body that your family can bury. And importantly, then any insurance payments can kick in to support the livelihoods of the people you leave behind. And I think, big improvements are there, but there's still gaps in my mind. And one of those gaps is about vessel stability. So there's been lots of changes in kind of like in Plymouth, where you see lots of gear changes. I'm concerned that actually the same emphasis on vessel stability isn't there from the owners and operators, and I'd like to see more focus on vessel stability. We're seeing some good improvements, but still not enough. And one of the concerns, again, it's a bit like the answer to the earlier question, is it's fine putting improvements in safety on British boats, and we should and we ought to. We must go faster than we are at the moment. But we also need any other boat from any other country that fishes in our waters to have the same levels of safety. Because if a fishing boat's going down, right, it doesn't matter what flag that boat has on it. The RNLI, the Coast Guard, the Navy will go out and risk their lives to rescue them. So we need to be picking up our safety levels for every single boat. And I'm especially worried about smaller boats. And as our fleet has changed composition, we need to put more effort into smaller boats because, I think the stats came out in the debate earlier this week. I might get my numbers ever so slightly wrong, so forgive me if I do. But the overall casualty rate for fishing is 56 per 100,000 that work in the industry. And that compares on an annual basis. And that compares to 0.05 for every other profession on an annual basis in the rest of the economy. So, we don't have 100,000 people that go to sea, so our numbers are lower. But already this year, we've lost 10 fishers at sea. On average, the last couple of years, it's been 6. And in Plymouth, we've lost a number of fishers from our community, as have other communities right around the coast. So there is still work to be done here. And, I'm good at having a go at the government where they're getting it wrong. But actually on this, they have been listening to folks like myself and the industry and have been doing a good job with their fisheries safety work that they're doing. And that's largely because it's come out of DFT. And so Department for Transport have done a good job on it. I've been quite impressed with Robert Courts, the new Marine Safety Minister. He understands it. He's putting the right changes in. This is good and welcome because safety really shouldn't be party political, but we are making progress, but there's still more to do.
When it was announced that you were being taken off Shadow Fisheries Minister, the position, there seemed to be at the Westminster, your last Westminster Hall debate, there seemed to be a great sense of that you're held in very high esteem by even the opposition. You've got Jim McMahon now coming in to take over the position. What advice would you have for Jim?
Oh, I think Jim is a really decent bloke, and he's coming into it not with the same knowledge as that I had, and that comes from exposure to the industry, that comes from conversations, that comes from people sharing their hopes and dreams and their fears and their problems. That will take time to come up, but I've been really privileged actually to serve in the Shadow Cabinet, and to be the Shadow Environment Secretary is something that I've been really passionate about. And I was, it's sad to be asked to be stood down from that role, but I now get to spend more time on the back benches doing stuff. And the advantage of where I have now is I no longer have a sign-off process to have to put all my announcements through. So I suspect that actually I'll be a louder voice for fishing on the back benches than I was able to be in the Shadow Cabinet. But look, fishing matters. And so my starting point for this is fishing matters. Now, I represent a coastal constituency. There's lots of jobs in fishing in the patch. I'm passionate about it. I spend a lot of time on the quayside speaking to fishers. That's all good. Jim represents Oldham. He'll need to be travelling to coastal constituencies and having those same conversations. I have no doubt that he will be doing that, just as actually Daniel Zeichner, who will be the Shadow Minister for Fishing, has already got the list of places that I've recommended for him to go, is already booking in his visits. But what we can't do, no matter who is in these jobs, and to a certain extent, in opposition, people do rotate around stuff, is no matter who is in those jobs, that we need a consistent line that says Labour backs our British fishers. Because I haven't always heard that from my own party as loud as I would like to. And I think just as we're seeing at the moment with farmers feeling quite betrayed by trade deals and food standards from the government, I think the votes of the fishing industry are also up for grabs. Doesn't mean they're all going to be voting Labour. Doesn't mean they're all going to still be voting Tory. But what it does mean is that those votes are more in play. And so to win people's support, you not only have to give a toss about them, right? You have to turn up. You have to listen to what they say and you have to act on what you've heard. And that's what I've tried to do over the last 3 years. And Jim inherits a policy cupboard quite full of kind of like Luke-inspired fisheries policies. But I want our next manifesto to be really clear. Fishing's been utterly screwed over by this government. There's no denying that whatsoever. What comes after the next general election has to be better for fishing than what came before. And that means not kind of like bells and whistles promises of unachievable things to win support, as we saw in the Brexit vote and also in the last general election. It means, some pretty sound, sensible, honest conversations and some pretty sound, sensible and honest policies. And that means, I think, a long-term plan for fishing, a plan that people can see what their role is, what they want to do. I think we need to be bolder on decarbonisation for fishing. So, at the moment, a fishing boat will use a hell of a lot of diesel and fuel to go to sea. Well, we can't do that if we want to hit net zero by 2050, 2030 or any date. So we need decarbonisation of our fleet. Well, if you are doing that, let's deal with safety at the same time. Let's deal with new skills on the quay side. Let's make fishing a career of choice. Let's land more fish in our ports so we have more revenue coming through our ports so we can invest more in our port infrastructure. The £100 million fund that the government has announced for port infrastructure, which does feel a bit like an apology fund for screwing them over in Brexit. Well, the 100 million will buy 3.5 fish quays. 3.5 fishing markets. It's not enough for the investment right across the country. So what is the actual plan? And we don't need it in 1 year. That can be a 5, 10, 20-year plan. Let's have a clear idea where we're going. And I think, what Jim and Daniel and the rest of the Labour team will be setting out, because I will be on their back making sure they are, is an ambitious plan that takes into account the views of fishers. And I have no doubt that the fishers in Plymouth are not going to stop talking to me just because I'm in a different job now. I'll continue having those conversations. We'll continue to make the policies better, but we've got to stop fishing being screwed over, because as I said right at the start, if we don't, we're effectively sleepwalking into decommissioning by stealth. And that means a smaller fishing industry. That means more jobs lost, more export markets lost, more domestic markets lost, effectively more carbon being used in importing more fish. And I think that's a lose, lose, lose for everybody. What we need is a win-win-win for everybody. More fish, more jobs, more science, more investment. That's a win-win-win. And I think that is potential, that's on the cards. But to do that, we've got to have no more nonsensical big promises from the government that screw over people and that erodes trust, because politics is the only way that we get change. And so we need our politicians from every party to up their game to make sure that fishing is not an afterthought. It's an important industry and it needs treating with respect and focus. And if we get that, I think everyone wins.
Question I have is on decarbonisation. How does fishermen that you've been speaking to, how do they feel about it? Is it something that seems to be complicated, or do they feel it's achievable?
I don't think anyone's got an idea how you decarbonise the fishing fleet, and that's the problem. But it has to happen. And so it's one of these really difficult things. We know we need to do it, but we don't know how we're going to do it. And so it's quite legitimate to say, right, let's come up with an answer. Because I couldn't on the top, if you held a knife to my throat now and said, you've got to give us the answer. Is it a combination of hydrogen? Is it a combination of marinized batteries? It's going to be different for smaller boats, the under 10s compared to the larger ones? What is the answer? It's probably all of those and above. But if you decarbonize, if you make boats more efficient, well, that reduces input costs. So it reduces your fuel cost, which means you make more margin at the end of it. It has the happy coincidence of cutting the carbon that comes out as well. So that's going to be better for it. So, at the moment, the industry, unlike farming, that does have a net zero date. So farming's net zero date is 2040. That's led by the NFU. Fishing doesn't have one. So it's just assumed that it's the same date as the net zero for the country, currently set at 2050. Okay, so let's say we've got, what's that, just under 30 years to do it. What's the plan? Because there's people taking out boat mortgages to invest in new boats that have diesel engines in, that will be drinking diesel for decades to come, right? What's their plan? What should they be investing in? What's the technologies that we want to invest in to see whether it works? And so, as an example, Plymouth, which obviously is the centre of the world, has the world's first electric ferry. It's only a small boat. It's like a little fishing boat, actually. Only a small boat, but it's using marinized batteries, and it's now pootling around Sutton Harbour, effectively taking people from one side of the water to the other. Well, that's battery powered, right? Well, if that technology can be proven to work at scale, and if we can make sure that the electricity supply going into that shore-based power is better than it is at the moment, well, that could cut carbon, it could cut air pollution, could cut input costs, and in particular, it could maybe stop the stranglehold that many ports have on fishers by charging them far too much for their diesel. So, there's real opportunities here, I think, but we need a plan. And at the moment, I can't see a plan. So I think we should get one. And that plan should be developed alongside the fishing industry, because ultimately, as our American friends would say, green is green, helps you to understand that the currency is green in America. But if we go environmentally friendly, we save money. And saving money in fishing means not only cheaper, better price goods, but it also means improved margins, which means more sustainable businesses. So it's a win-win again. But we need a plan to get there. And
another part of that plan is the offshore wind farms.
Yeah.
And is there much of an appetite on the south coast for them, do you think? Because I think that's a touristy place. Like, people always say, oh, go to Plymouth, go to Devon, go to Cornwall. They've got absolutely fantastic coastline. Do you think is there an appetite there for it?
Oh, there is. I mean, and there's not only an appetite for it, but there's a massive potential for not just offshore wind, but floating offshore wind. And the science on this is quite incredible, that we're looking at 300-metre high turbines that are effectively floating off the sea. So enormous opportunities in the Celtic Sea, off the western approaches, lots of opportunities. But to make that work, you've then got to zone areas for wind farms, offshore wind. But you're also zoning areas for highly protected marine areas. Well, you're not currently, but you probably are in due course. So that means the available sea for fishing could be constrained to where it currently is. Now, I would like to see a marine version of a land use map for our waters that properly says, in the future, this is where we're going. Now, those areas might move as fish stocks move, as habitats develop, as habitats recover in terms of marine areas, as we see different bits of our marine energy infrastructure. And it's not just the wind farms, remember, it's how you land that energy. So it's the connection. At the moment, we don't have a national grid for offshore wind. So every single wind farm has its own connection that lands on the shore, which is not great, but it also means that it's hard if you're dredging and if you're doing bottom gear to make sure you're avoiding those bits, because you don't want to get snagged in that. So you've got to have a joined up plan about it. Now, I think the MMO is a great opportunity to start that conversation, because it's clear that we're going to have more offshore wind. It's clear, although not certain when, we're going to have more marine protected areas. And it's probably clear that will increasingly see less fishing in those areas. Okay, so if that's the direction of travel, where are we seeing the fishing? What will take place in those areas? Where is the future? Is that sufficient for the size of the industry that we have? Will we need to decommission boats? Will we need to commission boats to make it fit? And if you have a long-term plan, then I think that gets us in the right direction. At the moment, we've just got a cacophony, a concert of sound bites from DEFRA. But I'd like every fisher to be able to see a proper fisheries plan that they can look at it and go, right, that's where our industry is going for the next 30 years. I like that bit. I like that bit. I don't like that bit. I think that bit should be changed to this bit. That's how you do good governance of fisheries. And it's not what we've got at the moment.
So 2020, what's Luke Pollard up to on the backbenches? I know we hear you talk about you can do a lot of campaigning for fisheries, campaigning for safe fishing, everything else. And will there be other areas that you'll be looking at, working hard at?
So I'm afraid relentlessly bouncy is the skill that I normally go with, and I'll be filling my time with a lot of good local and national campaigns. One of the ones that is not a fishing campaign, but is one very close to my heart that needs changing is in the constituency I represent. In the summer, we had the mass shooting in Keam. that saw 5 people killed and 2 people shot and injured. And I want to see changes in gun laws out the back of that. We've lost people from our community, including a 3-year-old little girl. And as the MP for the area, I felt it was my job to step up to make sure we got the support. We've now got much of the money that we need to support people's mental health and safety and security in the area, including investing in our schools. But we also need to change gun laws. And I'm concerned about, the experience that we saw in Keam. It wasn't Devon specific. The mass shooting that happened in Plymouth could have happened anywhere. And I think, as the MP for the area, I think I've got a responsibility to take the concerns that local people have and try and change the law. Now, it's not easy always to change the law, but on this one here, I think, having more time to spend doing that, well, I think that will make a difference. And if that saves a life in the future, that is time well spent. So I'll be doing that. But quite a lot of the issues that I was dealing with as a Shadow Environment Secretary, they're Plymouth issues. Fishing and farming are Plymouth issues. Decent air quality, well, that's a Plymouth issue, and so the climate and ecological crisis, climate and nature crisis, raw sewage discharges into our sea, the background I use all my Zoom calls. Well, it looks very pretty, but there's raw sewage outlets that discharge into Plymouth Sound all the time. So they need to go. So that's why for the last 2 years, I've been so fortunate that I've been given a seat on the front bench to effectively campaign up Plymouth issues at scale. My passion for my city does not change because I sit in a different place in the House of Commons. And so I'll keep going on that. But, it's about causing good trouble rather than bad trouble, I hope.
Look, it's been fantastic speaking to you. And I think that a lot of the fishermen around the UK and especially around your own area would be sad to see you leave the position that you were in. But we wish you all the best in the future.
Thank you very much. It's been great having me on, and I'm going to keep campaigning on fishing. So you haven't seen the back of me yet.
Thanks, Luke.
Thank you.